The alarm hit before I even opened my eyes. Red light across the ceiling of my quarters. The kind that means stop whatever you are doing and move. I was on my feet before I understood why, pulling my jacket on with one hand and slapping the comm panel with the other. My name is Elena Marsh, and I was not a soldier. I want to say that clearly, right at the start, because everything that happened after this moment only makes sense if you understand that I was not supposed to be a hero. I managed cargo manifests and supply routes for the outer fleet. I counted crates. I signed forms. That was my whole life, until the night the sky screamed. The transmission came through every channel at once, which never happens. It was garbled, half broken, stitched together from a signal that had traveled so far it barely survived the trip. But underneath the static, you could hear it. A voice, not human, shaking in a way that needed no translation. "Please, we are dying. Is there anyone who will answer?" I stood in the corridor with a dozen other crew members, all of us frozen, listening to a stranger from across the galaxy beg for help they clearly did not expect to receive. The message was from a coalition of species near the outer rim, worlds we had barely traded with, barely spoken to. Humanity was new to galactic society, still on probation in most rooms that mattered. We had a reputation. Reckless, they called us, unpredictable, too willing to bleed. So when this message reached us, it was not sent with hope, was sent because they had run out of everyone else to ask. They were not asking for an army, they made that painfully clear. They asked for medicine, for transport ships to move civilians away from a border that was collapsing. For anything at all, that we could spare without much cost to ourselves. It was the request of someone who expects to be turned away and is trying to make the refusal easy. I remember thinking, they are apologizing for asking us to save them. Within the hour I was called into the command deck, which never happens to someone like me. Crates and forms, remember. But the officer who found me, a broad-shouldered man named Callum Reyes, grabbed my arm in the hallway and said, "You know logistics better than anyone on this ship, and right now logistics is the whole war. Come with me." The command deck was chaos, but a controlled kind. Captain Nadia Okafor stood at the center of it, arms crossed, watching the alien transmission loop on the main screen. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone doing math in her head. "How bad?" she asked, and a young analyst named Peter Lang read off the numbers. A hive force, spreading across 3 border systems, overwhelming every defense the coalition had. These aliens were not a military culture. They fought in careful, measured ways, following rules of engagement built over centuries. The thing attacking them did not know what rules were. Captain Okafor turned to the room. She did not call for a debate. She did not ask if this was worth the cost, or what we would gain, or whether these strangers deserved our ships. She said, "Send everything that can fly." I actually laughed, a short, confused sound, because I thought I misheard her. Everything, not a token relief convoy, not a careful diplomatic gesture, everything. Peter looked as stunned as I felt. "Captain, that includes civilian transports, cargo haulers. The colony ships still being outfitted for the Kepler run." "I know what it includes," she said. "That is why I am saying it. Elena," she looked right at me, "you are going to be the one who makes sure none of it collides into itself on the way there. Can you do that?" My throat was dry. "Yes, Captain." "Then go." I did not sleep for the next 2 days. I do not think anyone did. What happened next was not glamorous, and no one back home will ever make a film about supply routing, but it was the thing that decided everything. I stood in a room full of screens, plotting flight paths for hundreds of ships that were never designed to fly in formation, coordinating fuel transfers, making sure hospital vessels did not launch before their medical staff finished boarding, catching a scheduling collision that would have stranded 3 cargo haulers in the same lane at the same time. It was terrifying work, not because it was dangerous, but because every mistake I made would be paid for by someone else, thousands of light years away, in a war I had never seen. The alien liaison assigned to our fleet was a slender being named Threll, from a species that communicated half in words and half in the shifting color of skin along their throat. Threll had been posted with humanity for 2 years, mostly as an observer, mostly quiet, mostly cautious around us, the way you are cautious around something you do not fully trust. Threll found me in the command deck on the second sleepless day, watching the screens with something I can only describe as disbelief. "This is not what we expected," Threll said. Their voice was calm, but their throat colors were moving fast, pulsing between shades I did not know the meaning of yet. "What did you expect?" I asked, not looking up from the flight paths. "Caution. A small gesture. Enough help to say you tried, without risking too much. That is what every other species sends when the cost might be high." Threll paused. "This is not a small gesture." I did not have a clever answer. I just kept working. 3 days later, our fleet arrived at the front, and I saw with my own eyes what Captain Okafor's 4 words had actually produced. It was not an armada in the way the word usually means. It was strange and improvised and, honestly, a little embarrassing to look at from a distance. Cargo haulers with makeshift plating welded onto their hulls. Colony ships, meant for peaceful settlement, now packed with medical bays built in a rush. Civilian volunteers standing shoulder to shoulder with trained crew, all of them answering a call that was never meant for people like them. But it was enormous. It filled the sky over that dying border world like a second horizon, and it had arrived faster than anything the Coalition itself had been able to send from its own core worlds. I was stationed on a support vessel behind the main line, still doing what I always did, tracking supply, rerouting medical transports, making sure the hospital ships stayed far enough back to be safe, but close enough to be useful. Through the comm channel I could hear the fighting begin. I want to be honest with you. I was afraid. My hands shook over the console more than once. But I kept working, because somewhere out there, people were counting on the numbers I gave them being right. The Hive Force, when it came, moved the way the reports had described. Relentless, without hesitation, without mercy, without any of the careful strategy the Coalition fleets were trained to expect from an enemy. It had spent years learning how Coalition ships fought, learning their rules, their patterns, their caution. It did not know how to read us yet, because nothing about us followed a pattern it had studied. Our pilots did not fight like the Coalition fleets. They took risks that made Threll's throat flash a color I later learned meant something close to alarm. They held formations that should have broken. They pushed engines past safety limits to close gaps the enemy expected to stay open. It was not always clean, and it was not always graceful, but it was constant, and it did not stop, and it did not follow the pattern the enemy had learned to defeat. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a cargo hauler carrying refugee families took heavy damage and began drifting toward the edge of the battle, engines failing, no escort left to protect it. I caught the distress signal before anyone else did, buried under 100 other channels screaming for attention. I rerouted the nearest ship I could reach, a repurposed survey vessel with barely any weapons, and told its crew, a young pilot named Danny Whitfield, that he needed to reach that hauler now, with nothing but his hull between it and the enemy line. There was a pause on the channel. I remember it lasting only a second, but it felt much longer. Then Danny said, "Copy that, moving now," and I heard the engines spike through the static. I will not pretend I knew what happened out there in detail. I was not on that ship, but I know the hauler made it out, full of families who had never met a human before that week, because Danny's voice came back over the comm afterward, tired and shaking, saying, "They are clear, they are clear, tell the captain they are clear." I sat there in my chair and cried, quietly, where no one could see, because I had just realized that the numbers on my screen were not numbers. They were people, on both sides of every ship I moved. And for the first time, the weight of that landed on me all at once. The battle did not end that day in some grand final victory. I want to be honest about that too, because the truth is better than the story. The Hive Force was pushed back from that border, broken, and forced to retreat to regroup. But it was not destroyed. The war was not over. What changed was smaller than that, and somehow bigger. Threll found me again, once the worst of it had passed, standing near the observation window of the support vessel, watching human and coalition medics work side by side in a converted cargo bay below, patching up whoever needed patching, regardless of what species they were born into. "Why?" Threll asked, and this time there was no calculation in their voice, just a question they seemed to genuinely need answered. Why would you risk this much for strangers? Your captain did not ask for anything in return. She did not wait to see if it was worth it. None of you did. I thought about it for a long moment, watching a human doctor gently wrap a bandage around an alien child's arm, both of them too exhausted to speak, but managing to smile at each other anyway. Because you asked, I said. That was it. That was the whole answer. There was no hidden strategy behind it. No long-term plan for advantage. Nothing Captain Okafor was trying to win. Someone had asked for help, in a voice that expected to be refused, and the answer had simply been yes. Threll's throat shifted through a slow wave of colors I still could not fully read, but I did not need a translation to understand what it meant. Something between disbelief and gratitude, and maybe the beginning of trust. News of what happened at that border spread fast, faster than any of us expected, not because of the battle itself. Plenty of battles happen across the galaxy and are forgotten within a season, but because of what humanity had done before the battle even started. Word moved between systems that had never spoken to us directly, carried by coalition members who could not stop describing what they had seen. A species everyone considered dangerous, reckless, unpredictable, had answered a plea for small, careful help with everything it had, without asking what it would get back. I do not think anyone back home fully understood, at first, what that message was going to mean for us. I certainly did not. Not while I was still awake at my console tracking fuel reserves and medical transports 3 days after the fighting stopped. But I remember Captain Okafor calling the crew together before we set course for home, standing in front of all of us, tired the way everyone was tired, and saying something I have never forgotten. They thought our reputation was a warning, she said. Maybe it still is, in a fight, but today it was something else. Today it was a promise. I stood near the back of that crowded room, next to Danny, who still had bandages on one hand from the strain of holding his ship together longer than it was built to hold. Threll stood a little apart from the rest of us, still watching, still learning what humanity actually was, now that the first assumption had been broken. I looked out through the viewport at the drifting wreckage of a battle that had almost gone very differently, at the makeshift fleet of cargo haulers and colony ships that had somehow held a line no one expected them to hold, and I thought about the voice that had first come through the static 2 weeks earlier, asking if there was anyone who would answer. There had been, not because we were the strongest, not because we calculated it was worth the risk, simply because someone asked, and we did not know how to say no halfway. That, I think, is the part of the story the rest of the galaxy is still trying to understand about us. And honestly, some days, I am still trying to understand it myself.